Welcome to Morning Coffee Guest. I'm your host, Simone Absalom, and for the month of September, PBCJ's Morning Coffee Guest has been focusing on suicide and suicide prevention. In this episode, we'll be focusing on suicide, the silent monster. With me in studio is Associate Clinical Psychologist Shade Nelson and Associate Educational Psychologist Mrs. Shamila Dawkins-Brown. We go for a short break. When we return, our discussion begins. Welcome back to Morning Coffee Guest. Suicide is not a word we want to associate with our young people. However, while adolescence is a time of life which can be exciting for many, it's also when young people are going through a lot of changes, asking questions of life and themselves. Stress factors such as extreme pressure to perform academically, bullying at school are factors that contribute to its occurrence. But just why is suicide considered a silent monster? How does it affect the youth population? With me in studio to discuss further is Ms. Shade Nelson and Mrs. Shamila Dawkins-Brown. Ladies, welcome to Morning Coffee Guest.
Thank you for having us.
And Mrs. Brown, I should say welcome back to Morning Coffee Guest. All right, my first question goes to Mrs. Nelson. Why is suicide called the silent monster?
Right, so suicide is called a silent monster because oftentimes when persons are dealing with some of the underlying causes, for example, depression, these persons are suffering in silence. And so you find that after the act, there are people who say, I didn't know, there were no signs, I didn't see anything, right? And so the reality is that unlike a medical condition, there's nothing to physically manifest, there's nothing to really show. And so you find that people suffer in silence, and it's after the fact that persons are aware that they were suffering at all.
Very sad.
Yeah.
Ms. Brown, what is suicide ideation, Mrs. Brown?
Okay. Suicidal ideation basically refers to thoughts or images pertaining to committing suicide. These thoughts or images can range from fleeting thoughts to extensive thoughts to the person actually having an action plan. So when we think of suicidal ideation, we're thinking of it in two categories, whether it is passive or active. In terms of the passive suicidal ideation, this refers to the fleeting thoughts that the individual may be having. So for example, something happened, a friend move away, or something like an adolescent or a pre-adolescent may consider to be something that's very stressful. For them, they may have thinking of suicide at that particular time, but then as the day goes by or as time progresses, they are no longer suicidal. When we refer to active suicidal ideation, we are referring to someone who actually has an action plan. So we know that this person wants to commit suicide, and they actually have a plan as to how exactly they are going to get it done.
What are some of the factors that contribute to suicide ideation?
Suicidal ideation can range from environmental factors to health issues. Some of the health issues that are factors for suicidal ideation are untreated or undiagnosed depression, or sometimes a person is diagnosed but they still end up committing suicide. Other factors are like mental health issues, which substances such as bipolar disorder, Other mental health factors are also health issues that can be considered conduct disorder, something of that nature. Some of the environmental factors are persons who are being bullied at school. Sometimes it becomes so much for them, they're extremely overwhelmed, they are unable to deal with what's happening with them. So those are factors for suicidal ideation.
That's a lot for
That
our
is a
youngsters
lot,
to
yes.
deal with at such an early age. Mrs. Nelson, what are some of the warning signs? What can we look out for in preteens when they are thinking about committing suicide?
Right. So there are several warning signs, despite it being the silent monster, that we can actually identify. And that's why this is such an important platform to really get persons educated on what those are. So for example, you may see a dramatic shift in behavior, right? So if it is that you had a child that was normally very social, you know, like to be around friends, but you find that they're isolating themselves, they want to be alone more. You may notice a dramatic drop in academic performance.
Yes.
So somebody who was previously doing very, very well, and suddenly you notice that the grades have fallen dramatically. You know, sometimes in preteens, which is different from adults, you may find that they become a lot more irritable. They seem very angry. And again, you're looking at what are some of the differences in behavior. That's why it's so important that you know your child. You may find that they start to talk a lot more about death. So they're talking a lot more about anything related to that. There's like a preoccupation, a fascination with it. Sometimes they may end up leaving notes or start to make threats. And you know, there's actually another warning sign that's a little counterintuitive. You find that sometimes they may get happy, like extremely happy. And that's because they're thinking the pain is about to end. I'm about to escape whatever I'm going through and I'm going to be okay now. And so you find that it's not always the depression and the sadness and the irritability and the anger. Sometimes they might get very happy. So we just have to look for any of those things. But any sudden change, anything that's dramatic, you want to query that.
How do you know when to intervene? Because teenagers are moody at best.
Right.
So
Right.
how would you, as a teacher or as a parent, know when to intervene?
Right. You know, when it comes to suicide, it's one of those things where it's better to err on the side of caution. So we know that teenagers are going through various changes hormonally, developmentally. Usually what's important is that you recognize, is this a difference from what normally happens, right? So if you know that you have a teen that's normally moody, and they're being moody now, okay, fine. If you have a teen that's normally social, etc., and you're seeing a dramatic change, a desire to be more withdrawn, so it's really the dramatic shift. In terms of when to intervene, though, usually once it is that there's any sort of red flag, you want to take that seriously. You know, it's very hard to pin down the time period between when somebody may have a thought and when they may carry out the action. So it's better as soon as you are aware of it, to see how best to treat with it instead of waiting.
Tell me a little bit about stigma and discrimination. How does that affect the child's mental health, and how can it then lead to thoughts of suicide? I would think that if you're in a situation where stigma can happen, that the school or the parent will be aware. How does it go down into that path?
Okay, so we're looking at stigma and discrimination. When we discriminate against a particular person, we are seeing by our actions and our words that this particular person is different from us for whatever reason. So when we think of stigma or discrimination, we're thinking of separating ourselves from another person, thinking of ourselves like on a higher ground and looking at the person. It's like, Jamaican term, you're looking down on somebody. When that happens, it, in a sense, affects the person's self-esteem. When their self-esteem is affected, it causes you to be withdrawn. It can cause situation of hopelessness, situation of despair. So I don't know if I want to look at this topic or a whole topic of homosexuality. I think this is something that we can touch to look at as to an adolescent who might be homosexual. In our Jamaican society, we are not accepting of this particular behavior. So a student who is experiencing that may be feeling that they're being discriminated against, that student becomes withdrawn, that student pulls him or herself within a particular shell, and as a result of that, they may have suicidal thoughts because of the environmental factor that is happening around them.
How can the school help, Mrs. Nelson? How can the school help with that? Because if it is that it's something that is there and it's a known factor, how can the school help?
Sorry, can you just clarify?
How can when you're thinking about the
stigma
environment
and discrimination?
Exactly.
Sure.
How can the school help to alleviate the stress that the preteen is under?
Right. Well, so it's very important, I think, that one, the school personnel, so the staff, etc., they are first sensitized. They're aware of what are some of the changes that teenagers may be going through. They're aware of what are some of the warning signs, what are some of the risk factors, because before you can really treat with anything, you need to first be able to identify. So it's getting staff members sensitized, and then separately from that, taking it further, putting certain policies in place. So ensuring that, if it is that there is a child identified as being at risk of committing suicide, what is the next step? What needs to be done? School needs to ensure that parents are a part of that process. Right? And also ensuring that other students are a part of that process. Given the fact that teenagers generally, they spend a lot of time with their peers, you find that their friends may know a lot more about what's going on with them. So ensuring that students are able to also identify if their friend is in trouble, and they know exactly what to do in a situation. Who do they report to? Who do they go to?
So have a conversation.
Absolutely.
Mrs. Brown, what is self-harm and how does this relate to suicide?
Self-harm basically means self-injury. It can be related to suicide, or as well as it may not be related to suicide. So what is self-harm exactly? It's when a person actually causes harm to bodily tissues. It may show itself in terms of persons who self-harm. They will be cutting along their arm. Some of them will hide it, even cutting their leg area. It also ranges from them having to harm themselves with that. They will light a candle and melt it and just drop it on their hands. Why is it that persons self-harm? They do this because of psychological and emotional pain that they're feeling. So it is actually for them, in their own way, an outlet to deal with the psychological and emotional disturbance that's happening with them. The person who self-harms may be suicidal, as well as, like I said before, as well as they are not suicidal, because I've seen cases where we have actually looked at students who are suicidal with the self-harm tendencies, and then we have also looked at students who are self-harming, but they are not suicidal. They are just dealing with distress emotionally.
Interesting conversation. Do stay with us. Morning Coffee guest. We'll be right back. Have a major role to play in protecting their children from abuse and in providing emotional support when depression and ultimately suicidal feelings arise. Welcome back to Morning Coffee Guest. If you're just joining us, our discussion, we are talking about parental connect and suicidality. With me in studio is Associate Clinical Psychologist Shade Nelson. Mrs. Nelson, and Associate Educational Psychologist, Mrs. Shamila Dawkins Brown. Ladies, once again, thanks so much for agreeing to speak with us on the issue.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so let's continue the discussion. If a child or adolescent is suicidal, what treatment plan would you recommend? Mrs. Nelson first, and Mrs. Brown, you can add your 2 cents.
Okay, right. So usually it depends on the urgency of the case, right? So if it is that this is very urgent, the child has a plan, they have the opportunity to carry it out, usually you want to get them into connection with emergency services. So that usually is the UWI hospital. There is a child guidance clinic there. What normally would happen is that child would go through the regular A&E processing, see the doctor, would see the psychiatrist, the child consulting psychiatrist, and then they would be able to do appropriate treatment. If it is that it's not as urgent, then you want to get that child in connection with a psychologist or a psychiatrist, right? Or both, quite frankly. So you just want to ensure in such a case that you're connecting them with the appropriate professional. However, you also want to make sure, especially if it's not urgent and you're going to be having that child at home before they access the services, that the parents are watching that child. You have to ensure that you remove anything from the environment that could potentially cause harm, and you want to make sure that you're keeping an eye on that child until they can start receiving the treatment that's necessary.
All right, Mrs. Brown?
And I would like to add that some parents are not aware of all those procedures. So sometimes what it is that they do is they may contact a school and they can actually speak with a guidance counselor at a particular school, a principal or a vice principal. That guidance counselor or principal or vice principal may refer the student to the child guidance clinic. So it's dealt with as a matter of urgency.
Right.
So through referral, you just state that this is an urgent case and they can deal with it immediately. The parent and the child actually go through counseling. So they will have, the parent has coping skills, mechanisms for dealing with the current situation that they now find themselves in.
Yeah.
Okay, what treatment or intervention can parents or family members receive in the case of a suicidal child?
Right.
They usually assist with techniques such as family therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy, because cognitive behavioral therapy has to do with the recognition of the mind, helping you to deal with your current situation, causing the parents to be non-judgmental in a sense, so giving them the mechanisms that they need to assist the child, such as active listening, understanding what's happening with the particular person from a non-judgmental standpoint.
Right.
And that help can come at what cost? Where can we go to get that help?
The child guidance clinic is actually at no cost. I know that Dr. Thomas has what's the name of the organization?
Choose Life International.
CLI?
Right.
Right, and it's a private
institution. Right.
So that would probably be at a cost.
Right.
Okay.
The child guidance clinic does have a cost actually, but it
does have a cost.
does, but it's a
Okay.
minimal cost.
Okay.
Right. It's probably one of the most affordable options.
Sometimes parents are reluctant to seek help for themselves and for their child or ward because they think that there is no confidentiality for the places they turn to.
Right.
Tell me about this issue.
Right. So the thing with confidentiality, right, it happens at different levels. So for example, you have confidentiality between the client and the practitioner. Now, there are limits to that confidentiality in the sense that whether it's a child or adult, if anybody expresses that they plan to hurt themselves, then that practitioner has an obligation to report the matter to the appropriate person. If it's a child, it would be a parent. If it's an adult, it's some sort of support system. However, if it is that there's a parent and a child in a session, the parent is aware of what is happening, right? The practitioner actually has an ethical responsibility to maintain confidentiality. That's only ever broken if it is that it is in the best interest of that client, but it's not something to be discussed casually, because unless that discussion is beneficial to their care, then their case should remain confidential.
Okay, so we were talking about support for parents and for the children, and in terms, we're talking about how the parent would deal with a suicidal child, ensuring that the environment is ready, keeping a close watch on that child. For the parent who's watching, what can he or she do?
For the parent who is watching, who intends to have a sterile environment or a safe environment, that parent can remove harmful items from the environment, items such as a firearm that they can use to, of course, commit suicide. The parent can remove razors from the environment. The parent can remove hanging ropes from the environment because ropes, I should say hanging ropes, remove ropes from the environment because, of course, this can be hazardous. So it's just doing a walkthrough of your house to see what could possibly cause danger. Are there prescription drugs here that the child can possibly have an overdose on? It's just walking through your house and finding about what is safe and what is not safe and preparing the best environment possible.
And I would also say searching the child's bags and stuff like that, because you know teenagers will say I can get my privacy, but if you're watching your child, if your child is having those tendencies, I would search.
And that's a very good point, because you can search and take away items such as scissors, knives, and other things that a suicidal person may carry on their person, just to carry out the act. So that is a very good thing that parents can actually do. Search the bags, find out what's happening.
Anything to add, Mrs. Nelson?
No, it's just to say I understand that persons may be concerned, like, you know, is it that the parents may be hovering at that point, but it's a balance. It really is. If it is that the child is at risk of harming themselves, then, you know, certain liberties will have to be suspended in the best interest of the child.
Do you tell the rest of your family, or do you keep it to yourself?
When it is that you have a child who may be contemplating suicide?
Yes.
I think it's important for persons to get support. It can be extremely overwhelming. You know, parents may go through a lot of guilt, a lot of ridicule, wondering, is this something that I may have caused? Is this possibly my fault? And so I think it is important during these stressful times to have support around you. Whether or not that support is family, I would leave that to the parent to decide. You just have to select what would be the best support for you. Somebody who can, who's non-judgmental, somebody who can help you to have an objective point of view, and somebody who can help you to get connected with the appropriate resources.
The question that you just asked, might I add, goes right back to the topic. It being a silent monster. So I find that my child is suicidal. Do I want to include other family members, or do I sit and suffer in silence? Maybe it is that in asking for support from another family member can be something beneficial for your child, because that is somebody who can be used to give another watchful eyes for you, you know what I mean? Because the parents are not necessarily around the child 24 hours a day. You do have parents who have to go to work. So maybe a grandmother, a loving grandmother who knows of the situation can actually assist. Offering extra support, being more attentive to the child at that particular time. That grandmother could just, as we Jamaicans say, shower the picnic with love. So the grandmother in that sense can step up to the plate and actually help. So we do suggest that if it is you can find somebody to assist with the situation, do not, absolutely do not keep it to yourself. Do not sit and suffer in silence, because it is a silent monster that can indeed destroy you.
We're talking about, thank you very much, Mrs. Brown, that was very good. We're talking about the relationship now between the parent and the child. That is when it is most important.
Absolutely.
And I want to know, in your opinion, is there a connect between parenting and suicide?
Right. So, I mean, the research has shown that there is. None of these, you would say, are causal relationships, meaning one automatically leads to the other, but what you may refer to as correlational. So there is some sort of relationship. The thing is, during this particular stage of development, you have teenagers going through what we call identity versus role confusion. So they're trying to figure out who they are. And so there is, to some extent, some amount of drifting away that takes place, and it's healthy. You know, they spend all the time around their peers and they figure out, what do I like, who do I want to be, all of that. But it's very important during this period that parents stay involved with their children, and how they parent their teen is very important as well. You find that the reality is that teens are in a transitional period. So it's between a child and an adult, but some parents do have a hard time adjusting. So they still believe this is a child. So you find that the teen may feel as if they don't have a voice. Their opinion doesn't matter. You know, all of these things help to feed into that isolation, this idea that I don't matter. And so it's very important that it becomes very relational, right? It's about back and forth. I hear what you have to say. I take your opinion into consideration. We're both involved with each other. I know what's going on with you. I know your friends, right? So it's not hovering. It's not what we call the helicopter parenting. It's nothing like that.
Right.
But it's just making sure that you are aware of what's going on. You know, it shouldn't be that your child is at school getting bullied and you're clueless, right? There has to be that kind of relationship where the child feels that they can come and talk to you.
Mrs. Brown, your take on the question?
Just a point that I think cannot be emphasized enough. I would like to add that suicide and mental health goes hand in hand. So if we can create environments where children are being parented properly, then we are creating less instances of adults or children themselves having mental issues. For example, if we were to look at the 4 parenting style, I'm going to go as quickly as I possibly can. We'd look at the authoritative parenting style. This is the parenting style where parents are actually raising children who are able to express themselves. They have an opinion in family matters. They are children who are able to be heard and seen by their parents. It is separate and apart from the authoritarian parenting, where the children are in the home. It's a situation where they are seen and not heard. It's a situation where the parent says, it's my way or the highway. So parents within this particular setting are actually raising children, not giving much attention to how that particular child is thinking or feeling in a particular situation. What are some of the psychological factors relating to children who are a part of this particular environment? They are children who, in a lot of instances, feel hopeless. They later on in life become very angry, very bitter because of how they were raised. If we can teach parents actually how to adapt to the parenting style that is appropriate, then what we are doing is to create wholesome individuals, healthy individuals who can navigate their way through life. These are individuals who are able to calm themselves down during stressful situations. How do we know that this is possible? Because research has shown that when you are calm or you are in an environment that is conducive to who you are psychologically and emotionally, then the brain itself releases hormones that are not stress hormones. Those hormones help you to remain calm within that particular situation. So we need to pay attention, I think, to mental health and as it relates to parenting.
All right, thanks so very much for coming to speak with us, ladies. We really enjoyed and got a lot of information from your output. Should someone confide in you that they have a plan to end their life or is thinking about suicide but not seeking help, then it's incumbent on you to disclose to a professional or a responsible adult to do something about it. You can save a life. This has been a Morning Coffee Guest. I'm Simone Absalom. Thanks so much for watching.